Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Is It Fascist? Today we're going to be taking a look at the Brotherhood of Nod, one of the most requested factions for me to look at. People have also asked me to do GDI. I honestly don't think I can cover GDI. We don't really know at all how GDI functions beyond it being some sort of technocratic military regime. I don't really know how much influence the constituent governments still have over it. We don't know if it really has any specific ideology, be it religious or conservative or liberal or whatever. All we really know about it is what little we get from the campaign missions, and it's not very well developed compared to Nod. Also, we have propaganda from the Brotherhood of Nod, who's far from a reliable source. And finally, it's difficult for me to judge any sort of emergency government because governments are necessarily going to become more fascist in the sense of this list. Like, they're going to become more nationalistic or collectivistic. They're going to curtail individual rights. They're going to demand more direct participation. They're going to take basically whatever they can, be it nationalism or religion or whatever, to unite the public. And you'll often have some sort of technocratic council or a junta that rules it. But that might not necessarily represent what the natural state of the society would be. So I don't know how fair it is to really judge it by that. You might be able to judge like the post evaluation, after it's gone through the change as a result of an emergency. Like, you might be able to do Starfleet before and after the Dominion War and see if it changed as a response to that. But like I said, emergency powers are common, and it would just raise the level of this. So, the Brotherhood of Nod. This one is interesting. It's a little bit difficult because Command and Conquer is a series that spans like 20 to 30 years. It's gone through so many retcons and development team changes. And you had Westwood, then you had EALA, then you had just EA, then it became like an attempt to make an esports mobile game. And it's just, stuff is not consistent from one game to another. I think, broadly speaking, even though it's weird that the genre completely changes, the Red Alert to Tiberian Sun, I think, is fairly consistent internally. I do think CNC3 is somewhat, but you get into a lot of retcons by that point. Kane's Wrath retcons even more stuff, and I don't consider CNC4 to be canon just because it sucked that much. It was just like, it was so boring and so bad and so ill-conceived. I've never made it past the second mission. I just get so bored, I give up. But as close as we can get to the origins of the Brotherhood of Nod, in one of the cutscenes, you see the symbol, the scorpion tail, on a, I think it's an Egyptian sarcophagus. It's some sort of ancient symbol, so it is implied that the Brotherhood of Nod has always existed, or it stretches back to biblical times or even ancient Egyptian times. It's very much surrounded in mystery. The thing you always have to keep in mind, though, with secret societies is their pedigrees aren't necessarily as long as they may seem. What they will often do is adopt symbols and names and other stuff from a previous organization and pretend to be a successor to it. This happens a lot with various Freemason groups, where one will go extinct, but then like 100 years later, someone else will just take the same name and symbol and pretend that it's a continuation. So whether or not the Brotherhood of Nod actually goes back to then, or if it's some sort of thing that was made up as a fabrication later on, we don't really know. We also aren't entirely sure if when it came to prominence. Now, I think that World War I was started by the Black Hand. I'm not sure, once again, if it's a coincidence or not. Someone can post in the comments. I don't know if that's ever really been established. I might have just missed that when I was looking at the material in preparation for this video. Regardless of when the organization was actually founded and became a significant size, It appears that it finally started to gain some prominence during the Great War. Now, the Great War in the Command and Conquer series, basically Einstein went back in time and killed Hitler. And because he removed Hitler from history, the Soviet Union was able to develop. The Weimar Republic survived. And so the Allies in World War One, or in this case, World War Two, or the Second Great War, I believe is what they call it, consisted of basically Europe and China against the Soviet Union. America provided material aid, but did not directly get involved with the war. In one timeline, the Allies succeeded in winning and established a new world order based on, I suppose you could say, liberal democracy. And that timeline is what happens during the Red Alert timeline. And the alternate timeline, the Soviet Union succeeded in unifying all of Eurasia, as Stalin would put it, a continental Soviet Union. However, upon conquering England, Stalin was assassinated by Kane through his infiltrator Nadia. And after framing her for killing Stalin, he makes the player the chairman of the Soviet Union. And he rules from behind the scenes. Apparently, the Soviet Union breaks up at a similar point in time, as it no longer exists during the 1990s when Tiberian Dawn takes place. And the map of Europe more or less looks like how it does today. Now, once again, this is when we start getting into the whole retcon thing. Was the plotline of Red Alert planned when they made Tiberian Dawn? Probably not. I think it was kind of a prequel that they made after the fact. So if some things seem kind of inconsistent, like why does no one reference the Soviet Union? Why do the borders look as though the Soviet Union never existed? How did it collapse? If none of these questions are addressed in the first game, it's because they hadn't really thought of it yet. Which there isn't anything wrong with that, but it's just if you try too hard to square the circle of Red Alert 1 and the other games, you're just going to hurt yourself. But at some point during the 1990s, a meteorite landed in central Italy and resulted in the formation of Tiberian. Although I have seen it spelled both with an N and an M and pronounced both ways. I'm not sure which is the actual pronunciation or which is the actual spelling. It doesn't particularly matter. So there is two theories as to the name Tiberium. Either it's because it was on the Tiber River. Kane claims that he named it after Tiberius Caesar, but who really knows? With Kane, it's hard to know what he's making up and what the truth is. He definitely knows more than what he's letting on, but as an egomaniac, he probably bends the truth quite a bit. When Tiberium emerged, Tiberium had all kinds of interesting properties. It would later, if we consider CNC3 to be canon, which I think it is because they do reference the scrin in Tiberian Sun and Tiberian Dawn. It is a plague of sorts that the Skrins send to planets to terraform them and get them ready for harvest. Tiberium is somewhere in between a plant and a mineral, where it absorbs all the minerals from the ground in order to grow. And beyond that, it also emits a sort of radiation that is a mutagen. It can syncretize with plants and animals, taking them over. If they don't die, they become strange mutant hybrids that seem to serve the Tiberian. You can break it down into its component materials. So if you take Tiberium crystals and you, I guess, shatter them or whatever, you get large amounts of valuable minerals very cheaply. I believe it is also an electricity source. So the Brotherhood of Nod was really the first faction in the world to take advantage of this. They kind of came out of nowhere. They had an intimate knowledge of Tiberium, and they were able to dominate the market and overnight go from an obscure organization to a global superpower. Now, the structure of the Brotherhood of Nod is not particularly well established within the at least in Tiberium Dawn. I'm not really sure how much they directly control countries, how much they rule from behind the scenes, or how much of like an actual state they are. Like, do they provide social services, collect taxes, and that sort of thing? Do they just rule purely as warlords? Does it depend upon where you are? Because it kind of depends upon the game. In some cases, they almost seem like a feudal society. In others, they're a much more totalitarian, centralized state. In others, it appears they largely exist underground because GDI has an overwhelming military advantage, particularly when it comes to strategic weapons over them, that they can't directly confront them. GDI represented a resurrection of the alliance that had fought the Second Great War against the Soviet Union, combined with the UN Security Council and the G8. This was back when, I think it was the G8. I think this was back before Russia got kicked out. I forget when Russia was added because they were added and then they were removed after the Georgia invasion. So it's the G7 again now. But these very organizations band together in response to the emergence of NOD, and that's where we get GDI, which would eventually become something of a global government. NOD itself would emerge largely from third world countries. The NOD campaign in CNC1 largely consists of conquering Africa. You managed to overrun most of Africa. It seems like you completely kicked GDI out, and the area is directly governed by NOD. By the end of Tiberian Dawn, and in particular by the time of Tiberian Sun, the world is very much divided. Now, I don't know if a lot of countries like China are theoretically pro-GDI, but in practice, it doesn't exist anywhere outside of the main cities, and the rest of the country is controlled by NOD. That being said, that's a bit of the history in the background. We're going to talk a bit more about the ideology as we go through this list, because I think I've rambled on long enough about the backstory of NOD. But I think it's important to try to cover it to give some context to it. I also think it's important to try to point out that there is some inconsistencies and stuff that was added later that probably wasn't thought of. So, is the Brotherhood of NOD a fascist organization? They certainly are aesthetically, but as always, I'm going into this without rigging, without trying to force it one way or another. We're going to go through this list and give it an honest try. So, number one, an ideological synthesis, a syncretic mixture of reactionary, conservative, and revolutionary progressive ideas. 100%. So the ideology of the Brotherhood of NOD appears to be a mixture of some sort of socialist third worldism. I tend to think of it being something like Maoism, just because it is totalitarian, but it's also very anarchic, where people will kill each other if they deem each other to be insufficiently ideologically committed to the revolution. There's a big focus on empowering the masses of some sort of permanent revolution, and largely speaking, the rhetoric is around class warfare and social justice, because most of NOD's followers come from third world countries. You also have a religious component to it. Now, NOD is not based on a specific religion. It's kind of collectively based off of the different Abrahamic religions. And kind of the totality. Most NOD stuff will have some reference to the Bible. You'll have like the avatar of Cain. You'll have the mark of Cain. You'll have Cain himself. A lot of NOD missions like Word Made Flesh or Deus Ex Cain will also be kind of a reference to that. In Cain's Wrath, you have a heretic named Brother Marcion, obviously named after the heretic who created Marcionism. So there is a lot of stuff in there, and Cain functions very much as a messianic figure who fulfills a role somewhere between Muhammad and Christ. I would say theologically, we don't really, they do believe in God because they reference God in one of their ideological statements. Whether they consider Cain to be God, an avatar of God, or a prophet kind of depends upon the game, but he is certainly the dominant religious figure, and they draw very heavily from imagery. I find they tend to more resemble Islam in terms of their architecture, like I said, their ideology, as it tends to be more kind of a jihadist thing, and it doesn't really have any of the theological principles of mercy, compassion, that sort of thing. Even when it comes to redemption, there's an idea of a collective redemption of humanity through Tiberium, but there's not really at an individual level. It has a very strict command structure, and any violation of it results in being killed. Also, there's the idea if you die for the cause, you go to heaven. That's at least implied. It also very clearly draws from fascistic movements. Obviously, there's a certain resemblance of the scorpion tail to a swastika. Every country has like their own variant of it, be it the Triskelion or the Iron Guard, like checkerboard. There's all these symbols that kind of sort of resemble a swastika. Also, just the uniforms are very fascist, the red and black. Red and black is kind of both fascist and communist. So I would say yes, it's very much so a combination of a bunch of different random ideas that kind of work together. Two, identitarianism with a clearly defined in-group and out-group, cultural, religious, ethnic, or racial. Now, Nod is I'd say it's an internationalist. It's always kind of difficult when we have a faction that is civic nationalist or religious nationalist or cultural nationalist, but isn't specifically ethnic. Now, if they were to make these games today, Nod would probably be like a bunch of, they'd probably all be black or Chinese or something, and they'd be like anti-white. One of the issues is most of Nod's leadership, with the exception of Marcion, are almost entirely white. So there isn't really that aspect to it. There probably is a racial component to it because most of Nod comes from third world countries, whereas most of GDI comes from first world countries, which tend to be white or East Asian. There is a very strong religious identity where people who are not seen as being a pure part of the faith are viewed as being outsiders. GDI is definitely seen as being this evil group that must be destroyed at all costs. So I would say even if it's not specifically ethnic in nature, it's a bit like when you get into something. The two examples I normally use are Arab and Hispanic, where there is a racial aspect to it, but you have Asian Hispanics, you have white Hispanics, you have African Hispanics, you have mestizo Hispanics. There's a racial connotation, but it's more of a cultural, linguistic, and to a certain extent, religious group. So I'm going to give them a point for this. If someone wants to argue and say, as people said to me, it can't be fascistic if it's not specifically ethnic or racial, that's fair enough, but I'm just going to give it to this for that. A revanchist or romantic nationalist desire to restore the nation to its former glory or avenge itself against a historical foe. Well, if we believe what Cain says, the Brotherhood of Nod is an ancient organization that goes back countless centuries, and they're trying to regain their former influence or their former glory, particularly after they repeatedly lose or manage to get a draw with GDI. They constantly talk about restoring Nod, about this oops, one second. This idealized future, this we're going to get revenge against GDI. There's always a very strong revanchist aspect to it, so Nod definitely gets a point here. Number 4, a belief in the supremacy of the party or state. Nod is not exactly a party or state. People have said it's a combination of a new religious movement, a mega corporation, a global government, but it does demand absolute loyalty and obedience for its members. And if you look at like what Nod military doctrine is, it tends to be masses of cannon fodder, fanatical conscripts backed up by highly trained mercenaries or special forces wielding futuristic weaponry. Um, Definitely there is a supremacy of ideology, a supremacy of Nod itself. While it can frequently, if Kane's not around, get fragmented into different pieces, I do think it definitely applies here. A conception of an idealized new man. Well, Kane literally in Tiberian Sun refers to humanity as a divine people. So even going back to Tiberian Dawn, there is a belief that Tiberium is a transcendent material that will lead to a new age. It'll lead to a new age where of technological progress, of use of genetic mutation, where humanity can be made better. By the time of Tiberian Sun, I believe that Kane's goal was to convert the planet and to change people, humans, from being a carbon based life form to a Tiberium based life form, so they would be fully able to survive in the new world. Also, they would gain all sorts of extra powers and abilities, perhaps becoming immortal. Divine, stronger humanity would be united for when the Skrin came, and they would be able to defeat them and then expand out into the galaxy. You also have just kind of the standard aspects of any sort of revolutionary socialist or religious cult, wherein it's very much about the destruction of the individual, the birth of the new man who's a man of action, who's a man who's willing to sacrifice for the greater good and for the good of the organization. So, aside from literally experimenting into cybernetics and genetic mutation in order to make a new man, I'd say it's close enough to something like Maoism or fascism or even Islamism to count. A foreign policy that places national self interest above ideology or morality. So this one is pretty much impossible because on one hand, Nod is extremely ideological. On the other, in practice, it's largely composed of warlords who will backstab one another, who will cooperate with GDI if it's in their rational self-interest, as Hassan did when he became GDI's puppet in the Eastern Hemisphere. Vega became a drug dealer. So I guess it's like if Kane's around, and even in the case of Kane, he'll do false flags and he'll. Once Kane was presumed dead, Killian immediately made a deal with GDI, although part of that was to backstab them and steal nuclear detonators. So I'm going to give them half a point here because ideology is not irrelevant. They did some things like launched Tiberium missiles to destroy most of Europe, which probably was not in their long-term interests, as it dramatically accelerated the destruction of the planet and it deprived them of some areas that they could have really used, but they're so ideologically committed to destroying GDI. Also in CNC3, they were willing to completely lose the World War in order to get their hands on the Skrin Tower. An indifference to or marginalization of economics. This is another difficult one because there's definitely a strong economic message that comes out of Nod. It's about redistribution of wealth to a certain extent. The Tiberium will create this ideal age where everybody's wealthy, every man a king. I do think, though, particularly as time went on, the religious half of it kind of became more dominant. You kind of, within Nod, you sort of have a more pragmatic, political focused group like Killian, Qatar, or some of the other people whose goal is more to try to hold territory, to run effective government there, and to serve as a global revolutionary organization. While there's a more religious side through figures like Anton Slavic, who don't see that as particularly important compared with achieving the overall aims. So I'm going to give them half a point here because it very much depends upon who we're talking about. A masculine approach to problem solving focusing on decisive action. I mean, Nod basically just uses force to solve everything. Even internal problems, they'll just sacrifice each other. In Tiberian Sun, Slavic shoots people all the time. He slits Hassan's throat. Um, Killian allegedly betrayed Cain and blew him up, but it didn't actually, and she was actually being framed by someone else, and then everyone gets liquidated. It's basically a mess. So it's very much, that's another aspect of it, is they view GDI as being effeminate and weak and unwilling to do things. I know there's a scene that really summarizes this well in Firestorm, where they capture an EVA unit and they're trying to reprogram it, and it initially says casualties are not acceptable, and then they reprogram it so it says casualties are well within operational limits. So I'm definitely going to give them a point here. Encouragement of mass political action, often the form of a political party or other organization. I think I'm going to definitely give them a point here. Everybody within Nod is told to take a direct part in it, to be part of the revolutionary struggle. The fact that they use massive numbers of basically peasant militia as cannon fodder to take the bullets for the more expensive forces, I think covers that. You have, if we're going to talk about CNC4, you have like an evangelical wing, you have Nod cults all over the world. There is a belief that all must be sacrificed for Cain's dream. Vanguardism, or the belief in an elite inner group to safeguard the new order or revolution. I mean, pick one. Most obvious one is the Black Hand, the cult within the cult, who functions as the secret police and maintains ideological purity and personal loyalty to Cain. You have the Marked of Cain, who are cyborgs. You could even consider Cabal to be some form of this. You have the Inner Circle, or the Council of Generals, who ruled under Cain. There's a whole just like political apparatus, mostly kind of the religious aspect of it, that governs from behind the scenes. So I would definitely say there is a vanguard. Also, the fact that Nod's been destroyed operationally so many times and keeps coming back because the foundation it's based upon is so strong, I think further supports this. An often charismatic leader, I don't even really need to finish reading this. I mean, those of you who like Nod or are sympathetic to it, you know Joseph Kukin. You know that, like, he's so charismatic, he's so charming, he has that just amazing shit-eating grin. He just has that hammy alpha male personality. And he has, like, the Shakespearean, well, he quotes Shakespeare often, but just ability to project himself. Watching, I was like 9 or 10 years old when I played the first game, and I was immediately just in love with Cain. I'm like, Cain is fucking awesome. I love Cain. The entire, well, they worship him as either a god or a prophet or an avatar of God in the entirety of it. And even if Cain's not around, they'll find someone else to serve as a messianic figure, be it Gideon or Slavic or Marcion. So definitely, I guess you could even count Cabal. And finally, sublimation of the individual and individual rights into the interests of the group, state, or party. Like I said, Nod was willing to do all kinds of insane stuff. Basically use nukes in their own territory, accelerate the rate of Tiberium spreading, even if it was going to kill large numbers of their own people. In CNC3, Cain blew up Temple Prime in like half of Europe, destroying the Brotherhood of Nod's headquarters in order to use the liquid Tiberium bomb to call the Skrin in. Also, to quote Anton Slavic, I live for Cain, I die for Cain. The difference is trivial. So, that being said, let us take a look at our score. As per normal, anything less than 8 is not fascist. 8 or 9 is parafascist. So, just to maybe explain this category, because some people have questioned it, A lot of the things that go in here are stuff that have aspects of fascism, but are deficient in some way. A lot of regimes I imagine would go in here would probably be something like Francoism or the Estado Nova in Brazil, actually maybe Brazil, but in Portugal, because the idea is they're either not progressive, they're conservative, but I think conservative authoritarianism would go a lot in here, where it is conservative in a lot of ways, it's authoritarian, it's nationalistic, but it doesn't include necessarily the charismatic aspect of it, the desire to try to get everyone directly involved in politics. Well, there is a lot of overlap, absolute monarchies or, like I said, conservative authoritarian regimes want stability. They don't want a permanent revolution. There's a tendency towards regularization, adopting either an aristocratic or technocratic government, and you eventually establish something of a elite who has a stake in the system and doesn't want to see it explode. Also, certain types of socialism which share a lot of characteristics, but are only the revolutionary aspect, and are internationalists instead of nationalists, would also be in this category. I just wanted to clarify that because people have been asking. And then, of course, we have 10 to 12 organizations that are full-on fascist. So far, we've only had one that's gotten a perfect 12 out of 12, which is the New Order in Star Wars. This one came pretty close. The Brotherhood of Nod gets 11 out of 12 points and is clearly within the fascist category. I am not surprised at all. Like I said, I do not sum these up beforehand, but I have a pretty good idea of where they're going to go. And ranging from the aesthetics to the weird syncretic ideology to the fanaticism to the revolutionary rhetoric, the promise of a new age combined with a lot of religious symbolism and homages to religious revivalism of the past, I think Nod very clearly sits in this category. Even if I was going to go back and take away the two ones that are, even if I was going to take away the half point I gave for 7 and the half point that I gave to 2, it would still come out as a 10 and would be within the fascist category. So the question, is it fascist for the Brotherhood of Nod, is a resounding yes. It is fascist. Probably a lot more fascist, ironically enough, than GDI. GDI, it's kind of ironic I was talking about it, would probably be in the parafascist category. Because it does seem to be some sort of technocratic military civilian regime that is authoritarian and does suppress the individual and stuff like that, but it's not revolutionary. It seems like it doesn't particularly want mass political involvement. It's not very much syncretic. I'd say if anything, it just kind of represents sort of normie conservatives, or just kind of political moderates who have been put in a very difficult situation and have had to adapt much more extreme ways than they normally would have. So that's the video.